Thank you very much for joining us this evening, everyone. My name's Scott. I'm going to be talking primarily on the birds of Morecambe Bay. But here in Cumbria, we're blessed with having not just Morecambe Bay, but also the Solway. And a lot of the species we'll cover this evening will also feature on the north coast as well. So we'll look at both this evening. A little bit about me for those who haven't met me before. So I started at the Trust around about a year ago. So I'm a reserves officer and looking after some absolutely fantastic reserves that we have across primarily the Morecambe Bay coastline. So here I am just up on the top of one of our limestone pavements at Hutton Roof. Which, although I can see the estuary from there, is about as far away removed currently as it can be, although obviously how the landscape formed, it would have been estuary at one point in time. But outside of work, I'm primarily a birder, and wetlands are my absolute passion. So most of the time, you'll find me down on the coast with my binoculars, with my scope, looking at birds or counting them for surveys. And then occasionally, I'll get all some weird and wonderful things with birds all around the world for different research study projects. But we're primarily looking at Morecambe Bay, but it's perhaps something that people aren't too familiar with what actually Morecambe Bay is as an area definitively. So the blue hatching here on the map shows what is the legally protected area. So this is the internationally important bit of habitat we have around Morecambe Bay. So we're just up here in Kendal, our head office is in Plumgarths. But it does extend down the coast past Ulverston all the way out to Barrow in Furness and then down the Lancashire coast past Lancaster and all the way down to Blackpool. So the estuaries down there are still part of this really important wetland system, and then up the west coast as far as Ravenglass. That area in itself is supporting around about 190,000 birds on average. That's covering just over 130 different species. We can't obviously do all of them this evening, otherwise I need a very, very long talk, but we'll look at a few of them very shortly. And one of the main ones you'll see around Morecambe Bay are these guys. These are oyster catchers. And Morecambe Bay is the most important site in the UK for them. So here in Cumbria, 37,000 plus oyster catchers spending the winter in Morecambe Bay. Another really classic species we have up here are our curlew. Again, the most important site in the UK for wintering curlew, well over 9,000 of these fantastic birds. And then also perhaps one of our prettiest ducks, eiders. So this second most important area in the UK, still the most important in England. The other site that pips us for the UK context is up in Scotland, but well over 5,500 eiders around Morecambe Bay. But as I mentioned, not to be outdone, we've got the Solway on our north shores. So that area extends perhaps from the outskirts of Carlisle all the way down the coast as far as Whitehaven. And if you look at that gap between Whitehaven and Ravenglass, it means there's only round about a 15-mile stretch of our coastline which isn't designated as internationally important for our birds. And then obviously extends up the coast all the way through Workington, Maryport, Silloth, and then we share the border with Scotland. So it does go over to some fantastic places like Calavrock and Southerness as well. Up here, slightly fewer birds, but still a big congregation, 141,000 plus on average, and around about 110 different species or so, slightly less than Morecambe Bay, but still a fantastic estuary. It's most famous on the Solway for its barnacle geese, so it supports virtually the entire wintering population of Svalbard barnacle geese. So that's around about 40,000 birds, give or take. So it's the most important site in the UK for them. And oyster catchers that we saw down in Morecambe Bay, so Morecambe Bay was the most important site in the UK, and the Solway is still the third most important. So of the top three for oyster catchers, those numbers there, we're looking at well over 40,000 oyster catchers using the Cumbrian coastline. And when we talk about all these numbers, we're obviously looking at data that's come from the survey, which is the Wetland Birds Survey. And that's a survey which focuses on non-breeding water birds. So we're not looking at all the ducklings and all the chicks that are coming through. These are birds which have finished breeding and are now coming through. So primarily an autumn winter survey, but we do take count of the birds right the way through the year. And when we talk about water birds, we're looking at these main groups really. So our waders, or people might know them as shorebirds, our wildfowl, which is a collective term for ducks, geese, and swans, divers and grebes, herons and egrets, gulls, terns, and then the others, which haven't really got a kind of a collective name too much. So things like cormorants and kingfishers and moorhens and coots, so our rails. And if you do want to have a look at what's going on with our water birds, so this is a report which is produced by the BTO. So there's a link there. You'll be able to scan the QR code on your screen if you want to have a look. It'll take you to the report. And that doesn't just cover Cumbria, it covers the whole of the UK. So you'll be able to see exactly where all these birds are, the best time of year to go and see the highest numbers at different estuaries. And that will break it down right down to a very small scale as well. So you can look at your local area if you're not from Cumbria. So where are all these birds coming from? We're getting millions and millions of birds in the UK every year, and they are migrants. They are crossing the oceans to get here. So quite a few birds coming down from Scandinavia, perhaps things like our curlew. We'll then have birds coming across from Eastern Europe. So widgeon in particular come from that direction to get to us here. Lots of birds coming down from Iceland, so things like hooper swans, pink-footed geese, golden plover, some of our ducks as well. But what perhaps people don't realise about the UK is that birds are coming from even further afield. They're also coming down from the high Arctic of Canada. And they're all coming to the UK because we are an island nation. We've got these fantastic estuary systems around, not just Morecambe Bay and the Solway, but we've got the Wash and the Severn, lots of estuaries around Scotland as well. And they're packed full of food, which we'll touch on in a little while. So they're great places for these birds to come. And we don't really appreciate that we are internationally important. You know, we've got the best estuaries anywhere in Europe, if not the world, for some of these wintering birds. They are absolutely vital. So any pressures that they get on them, whether that's through disturbance or through development, you know, they're real assets that we need to treasure. But one of the other reasons is that despite how far north we are, so it's not as far to travel, perhaps down to sort of the Mediterranean or down to Africa, we're actually quite ice-free by comparison. If we swing out west, you've got the UK there just on the right of your screen, and then over on the left, you've got the high Arctic of Canada, where some of these birds are coming from. And if you draw a very rough line from Cumbria all the way across the globe, you end up in the bottom end of Hudson Bay. And if you were birding in Hudson Bay this winter, you wouldn't be looking out for waders, you'd be looking out for polar bears. So the UK is much warmer than it should be for how far north it is. We've got these fantastic estuaries. It is a #1 destination for lots of our wintering birds. But how do we actually go about identifying the birds that we see out there? So there's a typical little flock gathered, a few birds feeding around. How do we actually start to break down what we're actually seeing? So for me, through this talk, I say we've mentioned we've got 130 odd species that occur in the bay. I can't mention them all in 45 minutes because I need to keep my time down, otherwise we'll be here till next Tuesday. So we're going to focus on sort of 10 main species. 5 of those are our waders. 5 of those are our wildfowl. And for me, these are some of the most numerous species in the estuary, or some of the easiest to identify, but they also then help you identify the other species that you'll see. And we'll go through some of that with each of them. It's also important to remember how big these birds are. So we'll try and do some size comparisons. So once you've got kind of fixed on the oyster catchers and the curlew and the dunlin, if you're looking at new species, you can start to compare them, and it really helps you be able to identify them. We'll also be looking at how they're eating and what they're eating, because sometimes what they're doing can actually help you identify the bird more than what it looks like. And we also need to bear in mind the time of year. So birds do look different at different times of year, and they also look different with different ages for whether they're juveniles or whether they're adults. So we'll go through the very basics, we'll touch on elements of all of those, and hopefully start to kind of build your skill set so you can go out onto the bay with a little bit of confidence to identify at least these 10 main species. So kicking us off with our first one is a species hopefully everyone is familiar with. This is our oyster catcher. And if you look through a field guide, it'll quite often be listed as unmistakable. It's a really bold black and white plumaged bird with that big red bill. Kind of pinkish legs, and you'll notice I've just highlighted there, we've got a white collar on this bird. And it's something that you don't see all the year. It's literally just part of their winter plumage. So a little subtle change, but sometimes catches people out if they look in a book, they see a photograph of an oyster catcher and it's not got that white collar. It can start to trouble people as to what they're looking at. But oyster catchers are definitely one to get familiar with. I say there's well over 37,000 regularly wintering in Morecambe Bay. So they start to be a good kind of opportunity to compare to other species. They're generally always around. And for them themselves, they're about the same size as a wood pigeon. So if you're familiar with those in your garden, you're looking at a bird that sort of size. And they tend to form, I say, big flocks. So when they're coming into roost, they form really obvious black swathes on the mud flats and on the salt marshes. And as they're flying around, they're generally quite noticeable. They're, a relatively large bird, can be quite noisy as well. And I have put some videos in, so I'm hoping people's internet supports this and it doesn't get too buffering. But any of the videos that we're doing on the talk are also going to be available afterwards. So if this doesn't work for you brilliantly, apologies and just bear with us. But an oyster catcher roost here, so this is one of the sites that I actually survey down in Morecambe Bay every month. And you can see these birds, they're being pushed in by the tide up against the shoreline. They're quite obvious. They're starting to run around as the water's pushing towards them. Then more birds are coming in. Even if you're kind of just going out and experiencing that spectacle, it's a fantastic experience to be at a wader roost at high tide. And once they are roosted, they generally, bills tucked under their wings, go to sleep for a little bit, and they are quite visible from quite a distance. You'll notice these sort of black blobs on the coastline. So definitely one to get familiar with. Relatively big wader, as are our curlew. So these are hopefully a bird that people are familiar with. Again, about the same size as a wood pigeon. They've got this really nice sort of cryptic streaked brown plumage. Obviously, the long bill, which is actually different sizes between males and females. Females have got longer bills, but on the whole, they're quite distinctive shape. They have got quite long legs, so like a wood pigeon on stilts almost. And for me, I always say they've got knobbly knees. I put knees in inverted commas because it's not actually their knees there, it's actually their ankles. But as a silhouette, they do stand out quite well. Okay, again, about the size of a wood pigeon, so similar sort of size to an oyster catcher. Heading in the other direction, for size-wise, we've got our dunlin. So dunlin are, for me, sort of the classic wader. They're, long bills, long legs compared to their body size, and sort of omnipresent. They're everywhere. So they've got usually sort of a browny grey back and head, longish black bill. If you think how big the birds are, it's not long in comparison to other birds, but for their proportionate size, it looks quite long. They've got generally quite a nice clean white belly and relatively dumpy little legs, but enough to kind of get around. And these guys are around about the same size as a blackbird, so obviously haven't got the tail length there, but body-wise about the same. And these are birds, I say, which are good to get familiar with because there are thousands and thousands of them in the bay. They'll quite often gather together in groups like this. So if you see lots and lots of small waders flying around together, it's usually a flock of dunlin, but there will be other birds mixed in amongst them. But you also get a slight change with the dunlin through the year. So here we've got another picture. And compared to our previous slide, would you say it was a dunlin? I can't see any of you to kind of get the feedback on that, but if we bring up kind of our notes, which hopefully everyone's scribbling down as we go, we mentioned previously a sort of a brown grey back and head. Kind of question mark, it's a bit more grey than brown, but there's some darker feathers in there. Short legs, well, it's in the mud, we can't really see how long those legs are. It's definitely got a white belly. longish black bill. Well, it's not really black, but then it's covered in mud. So it starts to present a few questions. This is where getting familiar with these 10 species are really going to help you sort of look at others, and they start to stand out a lot more for things that are new to you. But this is a dunlin. It's more into its winter plumage, and it's been feeding in the mud, so it's kind of hiding a few of its characteristics. We then may see birds like this on the estuary. So again, if we pull up our quick checklist, is it a dunlin? So it's not really got a brown-grey back and head. It's more of an orangey brown, gingery colour. Definitely got short legs. It's not got a white belly, but it has got a long black bill. But this is still a dunlin. And when I mentioned earlier looking at our 10 species, we need to remember the time of year, because birds have breeding plumages and they have wintering plumages. So this is a dunlin in breeding plumage. So they have the black belly spot, which can linger into early winter. They've got that orangey colour. And at different times of the year, birds will change. So they won't go instantly from brown and grey to orange with a black belly. They'll gradually molt through. So they'll change the colour over a period. So sometimes spring and autumn, things can look a bit 50-50, sort of half and half between them. And then you might get birds which are tucked up in the roost. So again, pulling up the checklist, it has got a browny grey body and or back and head. Definitely got short legs, definitely got a white belly, but we can't see its bill. So then we're looking at as many features as possible, comparing it to what's around and just trying to become familiar with these species. But this is a dunlin. It's just at roost, so it's all tucked up, waiting for the tide to go back out again. One of the species we didn't put in our top 10, but that you may well see regularly with dunlin are ringed plover. So these are about the same size and running around with them in the same flocks, but very distinctively different. So they've got these black bands on the head and the breast. They've got a brown sort of sandy coloured back, orange legs, and a short stubby bill, which is also orange with that black tip. But a bit like the dunlin, different times of year, they'll look slightly different. So outside of the breeding season, or as this picture shows, this is a juvenile bird, they don't have those really distinctive black bands. They don't have the sort of really vibrant orangey colours on them. So for this, you're kind of looking at the shape of the bird. If you change the colours, does it fit with what I know? And also behaviour for these two, which is a really good one we'll pick up on in a little while. So what if it kind of looks like a dunlin, but perhaps a little bit plump, if that's not too an offensive term for our next bird, which is our knot. So this is another really numerous species on Morecambe Bay and also up on the Solway. I say for me, they do kind of look a little bit out of proportion. They've got quite a big, chunky body, but relatively kind of small head and bill for comparison to that dunlin. Have still got the white belly, but for me, just down the sides here, what we call the flanks of the bird, they've got this kind of almost like sort of checkered sort of pattern down the sides. But if we put that knot at a different time of year in a different context, it looks very, very different. It's got kind of a very dirty sort of, looks like it's dipped its head in the mud. It's got very patterned plumage on the back. It's still got the streaks down the side. And this is again down to the age of the bird and the time of year. So if we pull up a close-up of the bird we had on our previous slide, you can see we've got these nice sort of grey feathers at the top, which are quite plain with a little sort of black stripe down the middle, which is the shaft. And then underneath, if we split them there with a red line, below the red line, you've got these patterned feathers, which have got kind of a black ring around the outer edge. And this is a bird which, these are the juvenile feathers, which have got that black pattern on the edge, and it molts those through over the winter and turns them into those grey feathers. So it can seem a little bit daunting, it can seem a little bit tricky, but even if you don't need to look at the individual kind of feather patterns if you're not trying to work out how old the bird is, just that shape for me is really characteristic. It's kind of a dumpy little bird with a head that doesn't quite look right. But at different times of year, if we pull up our notes for knot, it's not got a grey back and head, it's not got a white belly. it has got a long bill, but this is not in breeding plumage, so they turn this fantastic orange colour. You can usually catch up with them looking like this in the UK in sort of spring and very early autumn, but most of the time you'll see them. They will look sort of like dumpy little waders, if that's a polite term for them, but gorgeous. And these are so numerous, they do form these big murmurations across the mudflats as the tide's coming in, or if they're being attacked by a peregrine or a sparrowhawk. You get them, they're essentially like starlings out on the estuary. There's fantastic displays. And our final wader is a redshank. So redshank hopefully is one people are familiar with. Redshank, red legs. But they've also got the sort of brown-grey body and head, long orange bill, which here is covered in the mud. I say those long orange legs, and sort of a white speckled belly, little spots kind of all over them. And they're another bird which are absolutely everywhere, so they're good to get to grips with. They're a bit bigger than a dunlin, but a bit smaller than an oyster catcher, so they're kind of midway between them. So if you can start to learn these 5 waders, they act as a really good reference point when you pick them up against other species. So you're looking at godwits or some of the other shanks and sandpipers, you can kind of use them as your reference point to say, okay, this one's bigger, this one's smaller, this is how the colours are different. And as we'll touch on in a little while, this is how their behaviour is different as well. So moving on from our waders, we're going to move to our wildfowl. So as I say, this is looking at ducks, geese, and swans, which is sort of the collective term of wildfowl. And one of the main ones we'll get around here in Morecambe Bay is the pink-footed goose. So this is a species which is coming down from Iceland. There's around about 500,000 winter in the UK at the last count, I think last year, and quite a few thousand will winter around Morecambe Bay, up on the Solway as well, with some of the other goose species there. And they kind of look like they've got the body of a grey-lag goose, if people are familiar with that. So they've got this grey-brown back. They've distinctively, they've got a very dark chocolate browny head, a very short, stubby bill with that pink band, and obviously the bright pink legs and feet, which give them their name. But if you do compare that to a greylag, so just up in the top right-hand corner there, you can see their body, similar sort of colour, perhaps a little bit kind of more brown than sort of the grey-brown, but that stonking big orange bill. So even at distance, you can usually pick these out. And the pink feet won't just be found on the estuary as well. You'll also find them in fields near to the estuary, out on the salt marshes, perhaps even slightly further inland. They're usually quite a wary goose, but you will get big flocks of them feeding out on the grassland areas. And obviously, if you look up, if you're fortunate enough to see them when they're on migration, they are the species that forms the classic V shape as they're going overhead. And I have got another video here which was taken on the Solway a couple of weeks ago. And hopefully, if I've set it up right, you'll also be able to hear them, because you usually hear them before you see them. Bells, perhaps some of our reserves. I've been up on Hutton Roof before, just over in the east of the county, working with some volunteers, and I just hear that noise at a distance. And you start to scan across the bay and across the view, and you'll pick these little flocks up moving through. They're coming in from Iceland. Some of them will stay up on the Solway, some will stay around Morecambe Bay. Lots of them will head down to the Ribble, and lots more will head down to East Anglia as well. And then at some point later in the winter and early spring, they'll actually be on their way back up as well. So there's definitely flight lines across the UK that you can pick that noise and that display up. Some of the other species of goose that we get around Morecambe Bay are Brent geese. These ones in particular are the more common type. These are pale-bellied Brent geese. and they're quite a small goose. They're not a lot bigger than a mallard, if you're familiar with kind of the local duck pond duck. So much smaller than greylags and Canada geese that people might be familiar with. They've got these nice sort of chocolatey brown grey bodies, really nice dark black heads, necks and breasts. These nice little white collars always look like they're kind of going out to the theatre or something. And as the pale-bellied element suggests, they have got this pale belly. So these are the most numerous variety of Brent goose that occur in Morecambe Bay. I'm not familiar how many get up to the Solway, not too many, I don't think. But we do also get in Morecambe Bay occasionally dark-bellied Brent geese, which superficially look quite similar. So we've still got that nice sort of chocolatey brown back, the black heads, necks and breasts, the white collars, but distinctively they've got a much darker belly. So rather than it being pale, they are dark. So sometimes if the light catches them slightly differently, you can sort of struggle to pick out which is which. Usually sort of the geography of to where you're actually seeing these birds helps, but in Morecambe Bay we get both. So you need to get a reasonably good view of which ones are which. And this might be a view that you get out on the mudflats. So you need to try and work out, are they pale-bellied, are they dark-bellied? Some of them look quite pale-sided, but then at different angles, some of them are quite dark on sort of the underside on the bottom of the breast where the black band stops. So as a side-by-side, you can see that black band on a pale-bellied comes down, it really stops quite sharply, whereas on a dark-bellied, it kind of isn't as abrupt. It's still there, but if the light's against you, you don't notice as distinct a change between them. And if you're up on the Solway and you're not getting too many Brent geese, one of our other main species up there, as we mentioned at the start, it's the most important wintering area for barnacle geese. So these are very cute little goose. The population that winters on the Solway are coming down from Svalbard in northern Norway. There is another population that winters in the UK, which actually come from Greenland and through Iceland and down to the west coast of Scotland. But these are, again, quite a small goose, much smaller than a Canada goose or a greylag. They've got those grey bodies, they've got the nice pale belly and the black necks and breasts, but these white cheek patches. And you'll notice very quickly through a flock, those cheek patches and the patterns on each bird are different. It's almost like a fingerprint, so you can start to identify individuals if you get really, really into it. But if we move away from our geese, looking at some of our duck, so pintail are one of my absolute favourite ducks. They just look really graceful. Again, they're a species that in the field guides will say unmistakable, which is great for the male. But this is one of the first species that we've talked about this evening where we've actually got a very distinctive difference between male and female. So the males have got a nice chocolate brown head. They've got a white stripe which runs up the back of the head. Nice grey body. It looks grey. You can kind of see on the photograph there. It's actually a collection of black and white stripes on each feather. It's what we call vermiculation. It's common on quite a few different duck species, but they're just gorgeous birds. Little sort of creamy yellowy pale patch towards the rear end, that black on the underside, and obviously the very long tail, which gives them their name. One thing we should mention at this point for ducks, geese and swans is that they go through what we call a catastrophic molt, which sounds awful, but essentially they become flightless for a few weeks every year, and that's when they can regrow all of those feathers. So these birds, they'll lose all their wing feathers, so they can't fly, so they need to be somewhere safe. And obviously for the males, they'll lose their big long tail feathers as well. So at certain times of the year, tails will look longer than they do at others. But for the females, not a fantastic pose for this individual, but kind of looked like a female mallard, like every female duck out there. But the absolute key one that I always look for on a pintail is the fact that female pintail have got a very, very plain head. It's almost all one colour. Whereas if you compare that to a mallard, so I've just got some flight shots here of a female pintail and a female mallard. You can see on the mallard there on the right, she's got quite a distinctive head pattern. They usually look like they've got a stripe through their eye and a slightly darker cap. They also have a slightly different sort of wing pattern, so you can see quite a distinctive white bands above and below with a kind of blue through the middle. And for me, pintails, as well as that plain face, they kind of look a colder colour, if that makes sense. Female mallards are kind of an orangey brown, and pintail are a silvery brown. They're a similar sort of size, so you can't really use that against them. But pintail's absolutely gorgeous bird to catch up with on the estuaries around Cumbria. And then my favourite duck, which is the widgeon. So a very cute little duck. Again, differences between males and females. And males, again, silvery grey body. And they've got sort of an orangey mahogany sort of head with this really distinctive sort of orangey cream Mohican stripe. Females, by comparison, are, as most ducks are, sort of brown all over. Different shades of brown. They're still a very pretty duck, but they have got these short, dumpy legs. And that's because they are primarily sort of a grazing species. So they'll be out on short areas of grassland on the coastline, but they'll be waddling their way through the mud as well, picking out what they can find. They make a really distinctive whistle call, so you can usually hear them, and they'll usually be in quite big flocks as well. And the males have also got an extra trick. So if you ever see a flock of duck flying past out on the bay and you're not sure whether they're pintail, whether they're mallard, whether they're widgeon, look out for these big white wing patches on the male. So when they're in their full plumage, you'll be able to pick these out really distinctively when they're in flight. So there's a big flock here of mixture of males and females. And also a bar-tailed godwit, for any kind of eagle-eyed amongst you there, just off the centre of the photograph. But if they're slightly further away, here's a mixed flock of pintail and widgeon. So pintail, they are slightly bigger than widgeon. They look a bit longer, a bit more sort of elongated. You can see those long tail feathers on the males. But the male widgeon that are highlighted there with the red circles, you can see those big white wing patches that stand out quite well. And our final duck is our shelduck. So shelduck are quite a distinctive bird that are out on the bay. They've got the sort of what is actually a dark green head. It looks black on this photograph. The big red bills. They've got an orange band around their breast. So if they're out of the water a bit more, you can see that quite distinctly. And a predominantly white body. So even at a distance, it's quite easy to start picking out a shelduck. So those are kind of a really quick run through of the 10 main species. If you do have any particular questions on things or you want me to go back over, just pop any questions into the chat and Helen will pick those up at the end. If we run out of time to answer as many questions as possible, I'm also going to get the questions off Helen and answer all the Q&As, and they'll get emailed out to everybody who's watching this talk. So fill the chat with questions. I'm making work of myself there, Helen, but it'll be really good to answer as many of your questions as possible so you can really experience just how fantastic our estuaries are. But if we're looking out there at that scene we just saw, I say oyster catchers are kind of a really good starting point. So the more you look, the more you see. So here's our first one. We can use that as a reference point and very quickly, oh, there's more, there's more, there's more, there's more. They're all over the place. So that if we know roughly what size they are, we can start to then look at the birds that are around them. So we've got a nice group of birds just in front of us here. If we zoom into them, so we've got an oyster catcher just at the background. So the birds in front, they're kind of greyish, brownish, they're tucked up, they've got a white belly, look like they've got short legs, they're definitely smaller than an oyster catcher. So we could presume from the 10 that we've quickly covered this evening that they might be Dunlin. Same sort of shape, same sort of colours. But this is where I would encourage you to really look and not just see, if that makes sense. So look at what's there, go through everything, because you'll then notice, hang on, there's a smaller one mixed in amongst them. And it's the smaller one which is actually our Dunlin. So we're looking at something that's like Dunlin, but a little bit bigger, but smaller than an oyster catcher. So hopefully from the talk this evening, you'll realise that they're probably not. So again, sort of that classic wader shape between them, but not being that slightly larger bird than a dunlin. So it's all about really using what's around you to try and identify what you've got, getting familiar with those species and how they're behaving as well. So a bit of a better kind of comparison between the knot and the dunlin. So here we've got a dunlin, relatively small little wader, not that little bit bigger, but same structure, the classic wader structure, long bills, long legs, comparative to their body. But I say time and time again, not for me, just look that little bit kind of plumper, a little bit chunkier than a dunlin. So what about if the birds are moving around a lot? We had that flock previously where they're all roosting, they're all asleep, they're relatively easy. You can train your camera on them, you can train your spotting scope on them, you can have a really good look. But if birds are moving around as they do, so we've got a flock here of knot and dunlin and possibly a few other bits and pieces, some redshank in there as well. How can we actually start to identify these birds if they won't stay still for us to look at? So I've pulled up a little bit of video here. Again, this will be go out on our website and the link will get sent out to everyone. So if it does buffer and doesn't show for you very well, you will still be able to see what we're talking about. But I'm looking here at two species that we can easily identify at a distance. And this is a bit of close-up video just to kind of get you in tune with it. So we'll just press play on that. And just hopefully about to come in on the bottom left of the screen is ringed plover. So one of the species we looked at earlier on. And these are a visual feeder, as all the plovers are. So ringed plover, grey plover, golden plover, lapwing, they all are visual feeders. They'll run along, as you'll see, they'll stop, they'll look, check what's going on, and if they see some food, they'll bend down and pick it up and move on to the next one. If you get a really good view, sometimes on this video you can see it, they will actually stick their foot slightly in front of them and they'll give it a quick shake and a quick quiver to try and disturb the surface and see if any food presents itself that way. If you compare that to the bird in the background, which is our dunlin, so again, more of our classic wader shape, but I always describe them as being like little sewing machines. They're head down, they're feeding by touch at the end of the bill, and they're literally just going along and seeing what they can find in the mud. So two species that are quite often together out on our estuaries, but two distinctive ways of feeding that if we then take the video a little bit further away, so this might be a view that you get through your binoculars. So this was just filmed over on the coast at Roosbeck, literally from my car a couple of days ago, just for this talk. But you can start to look at how the birds are moving. You can see the ringed plovers there. They run along, they stop, and then they dip down to pick up the food. And then you've got the dunlin there in the center of the frame now. It's like a little sewing machine. You're going along. Occasionally they will run from feeding site to feeding site, but generally it's head down, probing away. I say like this sort of little sewing machine action. So once you've kind of started to look at what's out there with these 10 species, you can then hopefully start to pick them out in the flocks that we've got on the bay. So here we've got some shelduck. So I say they're quite distinctive, quite big ducks. They've got those white bodies, the black stripes down the back, the dark heads. We've got some pintail mixed in here as well. So although you can't quite make out the coloration of them, you can kind of start to see that white stripe on the back of the head. Some of them you can see the long tail, but that classic pale patch towards the rear end is really distinctive, even sort of in poor light conditions. You can then use those species to look at what's around them. So what are the pintail with? Have they got widgeon with them? Have they got teal with them? The oyster catch is the same as we've just done. Have they got other birds which are smaller or a similar sort of size with them? And for flocks like this, species that we haven't touched on this evening, we'll have to do a part two, but these are bar-tailed godwits. So very similar sort of plumage to a curlew, but they are a bit smaller. We've got one bird there on the right at the front, which has got his bill out, and you can see it's got a straight bill, which kind of got a pinky colour. But mixed in amongst them, we've got those dunlin. So if those dunlin are with other birds, you can start to then pick out how they compare to birds that you're familiar with. So it's all about going out, getting as much experience as possible, really seeing what is there, looking in detail at them. And if you've got a good view of this photograph, you'll notice just on the left-hand side, we've got a little cluster of Dunlin. We've got our bar-tailed godwit. We've got one that's kind of got its bill out and just given itself a bit of a scratch. And then we've got another bird hidden in the flock, just hidden behind the shadow. It's bigger than a Dunlin, but smaller than a godwit. That's, again, probably another one of our knot. So just a kind of reminder to look, not just see, really investigate what's going on there. So we talk a lot about kind of what the species are, how to identify them, but I'd also like to finish our talk this evening on actually my favourite places to go and see them, places that I've taken some of these photographs, some of those videos. So for Morecambe Bay, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our two nature reserves that stick out into the bay. So we've got South Walney there, just off Barrow-in-Furness. Fantastic site for waders. You've got the sea and the estuary all the way around you. You've obviously got lots of bird hides there, so you can sit down in relative comfort. If it's a bit drizzly or a bit windy, you can usually get a good shelter area. And the birds are then coming to you, particularly at Lighthouse Bay at the end of the peninsula. Lots of birds will gather there. You've also got the opportunity to look out to sea for looking for the eiders or divers or gannets and other birds that are passing. So a fantastic site. Humphrey Head, which is actually one of my nature reserves, will be well known for its rare plants, but perhaps not for its estuary birds. So although the birds aren't on the reserve itself, Humphrey Head is this peninsula that sticks out into the bay, and it gives you a really fantastic elevated panoramic view of what's going on. And on that bit of coastline alone, there's generally around about 30,000 waders flying around at high tide roost at this time of year, mainly knot, dunlin, curlew, and oystercatcher. So some of the species that we've mentioned on the talk this evening. So two brilliant places to go to. There's also, just to the west of Humphrey Head, there's Cumbria, where there's a walk around the coast there along the seawall, where I actually do my surveys. So there's anything up to 5,000 oyster catchers there on the peninsula, lots of curlew, lots of dunlin, lots of other species too. Roosbeck, where I filmed some of those videos with the dunlin and the ringed plover. Roosbeck's brilliant, although it looks like a really bleak landscape. You can park up on the side of the road there, and the birds are literally sort of a few feet away, just down on the mudflats, provided they've not been scared off by a dog walker that got there first. Grange over Sands, so along the promenade there, you can get a good view of different species. If you go just east of Grange over Sands to Holme Island, the bit of salt marsh between Holme Island and the Kent Railway Viaduct, that's a really good roosting area for lots of oyster catchers and curlew. And if you're heading around into Lancashire, obviously you've got the facilities at Leighton Moss. So as well as the hides in the reed bed, you've got a few hides which are out on the edge of the salt marsh. Those tend to be a bit sporadic, so you need the right tide to be able to get the birds to come right across the marsh. Otherwise, they'll stay out of sight, but still a fantastic reserve to go to. And actually, if you're down a bit further south, just the promenade in Morecambe, so just the breakwaters there, birds will be roosting sort of right on the edge of the road, so really, really accessible. And last but not least, we also need to mention the Solway. I've not spent loads of time on the Solway, but from the few years that I've been sort of visiting that area, some of the main sites I'd recommend were the coast and the estuary just off Drumbrough, which means you can then also nip into our nature reserve at Drumbrough Moss if you'd like to make a day of it. Just round the headland at RSPB Campville Marshes. So the coast there, again, you can drive along the coast road. The birds are on little pools and on the estuary, not too far away from the road. Around the estuary at Anthorn, so just on the other side, I found quite productive for curlew and golden plover. A lot of redshank there as well. And if you are heading over the border and up into Scotland, you've got the Wildfowl Wetland Trust Reserve at Calavrock, where you'll get a lot of birds out on the salt marsh there. And if you fancy going further afield, Southerness Point can be a really good way to roost as well. You know, thousands of birds roosting off the peninsula there. And for me, I think, Helen, I'm a minute over at most, which isn't too bad considering that's my first proper run through in anger of that presentation. So thank you all very, very much for joining us this evening. And yeah, we'll go through some questions.
Great. Yeah, we've only got a couple of questions in the chat at the moment. So if anybody else would like to ask, please ask away now. Briefly, I will just tell you what we do after talks. So I'll take this recording and pop it on YouTube and send a link out in an email that I'll send later this week. Scott, as mentioned, has also written a blog to go along with this talk, where you'll be able to see the videos that are embedded in the talk this evening. So I'll pop a link to that in the email that I send you with this recording as well. So we'll look at a couple of questions, and again, please do pop anything in the chat that you'd like to know about. So you did answer Paul's first question about best places to see those birds with an excellent map. Thank you for that. But he's also asked what time would be best to see the birds as well.
Yes, I forgot to write that down as my prompt. Perfect question. The tide is coming in. High tide is a great time to go to these roosts. That's when the most birds are starting to gather. But the tide actually starts running 2 hours before the high tide time. So if you're on some of the estuaries like the Kent and the Leven, you get a little bit of a tidal wave that goes up the river when on the big tides. But as that tide's starting to work its way across the mudflats, the birds are obviously losing that dinner table. Another thing I didn't mention during the talk was that the estuary mud around the UK, it's been calculated if you take a square metre of it and dig down just an inch, it's got the same calorie content for these birds as 13 chocolate bars for us. So there's loads of food out there, but once it gets covered by the tide, they've got to move. They can't just stand there. So they're coming up to those promontories. And that starts, say, 2 hours before. So if I was ever going to do a survey or a count or just experience that spectacle, I'd look to get there 2 hours before the high tide for the local area and then just sit back and enjoy.
Wonderful, thanks. So James asked, how do you count all the birds when you're doing a survey, especially if they're moving around?
It can be quite difficult. So for my survey, I'm just on the edge of the Leven estuary as it comes down on sort of my right and goes out onto the bay. Different species kind of do different things. Some of them will be in my area and they'll move off, so I won't worry about counting them too much. But as that tide's coming in, that 2 hour window, it's not a case of all the birds see the water and they all gather together and they all fly to the roost straight away. They'll start to gather in little kind of satellite flocks. So those are the points where I try and count them all. So those might be, a group of 50 here, a group of 100 there, a group of 20 here, and you can start to add them all up. So you're not trying to count perhaps 5,500 oyster catchers all in one go. But sometimes you'll get a peregrine go through or a hen harrier or something exciting. Everything will fly around and get mixed up. And at that point, it's kind of a bit of a guessing game, but an educated guess. So you can actually count kind of chunks of flocks. So you can count maybe 10 or 20 or 50, and you can go visually, that looks like that. So you can start replicating it through the flock. It's a bit crude. It kind of works most of the time, and it is just an experience thing. People do use tally counters as well, so you can kind of get your thumbs busy and start clicking away as you're going through a flock. Some people will count 10 and then click, 10 and then click. So there's different kind of techniques, but it's all about experience, just going out regularly, practicing what you're doing. And all those numbers then get fed through to that national data set, which I pulled the numbers from at the start of the talk. And that then reports back as to what condition our estuaries are actually in and whether they need extras or protections.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. We don't have any more questions, but lots of lovely people are saying that you've done a great talk, so well done.
Glad you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Yeah, so as I say, yeah, we'll send the recording of this talk out later on this week so you can watch back if you'd like. And I hope that you found it really informative. And thank you very much, Scott, for sharing your knowledge with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, get out there this weekend if the weather's right. Get out and enjoy these fantastic estuaries that we're so blessed to have here in Cumbria.
Brilliant. Thank you, Scott. All right, we'll say goodnight. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.